Aloha and welcome to Channel 64. We're broadcasting live from our Resonance Academy virtual classroom. My name's Teresa Collins and I'm the interim director of the Academy, and I'm excited to have our Academy students from all around the world joining us today, along with you, the rest of you members of our extended community. We launched this series in the spring when we opened up the Delegate Level 1 program self-study. And each episode in this series has been hosted by one or more of our Academy faculty members. And each episode has focused on themes that relate to the 6 modules of the Delegate Level 1 course. I think we've got some noise in the background. I think Marshall might need to mute. It's got a noisy. Marshall, could you mute for us, Marshall? Yeah, great. So as I was saying, each of these episodes have been focused on themes that are related to the 6 modules of the Delegate course. And I'm going to tell you those for those that are just here visiting so that you understand what we've been doing during this Channel 64 series. We've been exploring worldview. We've been exploring the importance of thinking differently. We had an episode that explored modern physics. And then unified physics just last week with William Brown, which we also opened up to the public. And then this episode, episode 5, on ancient origins and the fundamental pattern. And the 6th episode, which will be coming in January with Nassim Haramein and a few other faculty, implications and applications of unified physics in the heart of our everyday lives. So it's been a really exciting series. And up until recently, these episodes have only been available to our Academy students. But we wanted to open them up to the general public because these are really cutting-edge conversations and dialogues that are happening that we feel are important for everybody to be involved in. And we wanted to give you a taste of what it's like to be inside the Academy and invite you to come join us. So we're glad that you're here. As I said, the 2nd episode was last week with William Brown, where we explored the unified space memory network from cosmogenesis to consciousness. And it was a brilliant presentation. I've watched it twice now, and I'm really starting to understand at a deeper level what William is bringing forth in that presentation and talk, and really what it says about how to apply unified physics into the heart of our lives. So if you haven't seen it, you can watch the replay. And the episode today with Jamie Janover, who's our ambassador for the Resonance Project and one of our faculty members, and Marshall Lefferts, who's on our board of directors and also our faculty member, will be exploring ancient origins and the fundamental pattern. And I have a feeling this is going to be a really fun ride. So before I turn it over to Marshall and Jamie, I just want to welcome everyone again, our students and our guests alike, to our virtual classroom here. And to say all you need to do for the next 90 minutes is to relax, sit back, and enjoy the session. So have fun. So first, I think I'd like to introduce Marshall Lefferts, and Jamie and Marshall are going to introduce each other. And then I believe Marshall is going to get started on our journey today. Marshall?
Thanks, Teresa. Welcome, everybody, to Channel 64. Happy to be here with everybody. Great to be here with Jamie. And thank you, Emily, in the background, for all you're doing, as always, to make this run as smoothly as we can. Yeah, we're going to have a good little dive into these kind of very interesting topics in relationship to the whole field of unified physics that looks at the ancient origins and the fundamental pattern. And Jamie and I are going to share some of that as we go through it, and then we'll take some Q&A at the end. I know a lot of interesting questions have been posted already. Thank you, everybody, for putting them into the Crowdcast Q&A. If you're not aware of that, there's a little Q&A link below the video where you click that, and then you can post questions. And then we can vote on questions as they come in. So the more popular questions get up to the top. It's not possible to get to all the questions in these sessions. And so that gives us a chance to see, what is of most interest. And so just look at the questions, and if you like them, click the vote button and get them up to the top and add your own questions, and we'll get to what we can. So before we get started, we're going to just do a little informal introductions here. I'm going to introduce Jamie. Jamie Janover is, well, he's our ambassador, as Teresa said. He's earned that title of ambassador for the Resonance Project Foundation by being really the preeminent presenter around the world of Nassim's theory and the model of unified physics and all these related topics like we're exploring tonight. And Jamie met Nassim back in 2003. He's known Nassim for a long time and bugged him to get some programs going, the Emissary program and the Delegate program when it was live. Jamie has shared dozens of live Delegate program weekends around the world. Jamie's also an awesome musician, goes to festivals. He lives on Festival Earth, as he calls it, and so he travels and does music and shares this information to audiences all over the world. So with that, he has really earned the role and title of our ambassador, and he's really excellent at taking this broad and in-depth information and putting it into a very user-friendly format and making it fun and engaging. So we're always appreciative of Jamie when he gets to do this with us. And so really happy to be doing this today with you, Jamie.
Thanks,
Marshall, for joining us. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is Marshall Efforts. And, Marshall's been diving into this material, way longer than I have. He's been, I think, on this for about 37 years. He even crossed paths with Buckminster Fuller at one point and has been studying Bucky's work in depth for a long time and has developed a bunch of his own ideas and has manifested that into art and design and a website. He's got a page and a website called Cosmometry that I highly recommend, and you can check out the imagery and stuff. I know Marshall's about to show you some imagery that even in all of my years of searching for imagery and posting material on this, it's stuff that I've never seen before. So even the people that have seen Nassim speak many, many times or seen myself or other emissaries speaking, there's going to be some new information here coming from Marshall. He's going to kind of review the idea of the fundamental pattern that is the foundation of our reality as described by unified physics. And the details of this are very deep and covered in many modules leading up to this. So now what Marshall's going to do is kind of encapsulate how we got to what this fundamental pattern is, and then I'm going to take that fundamental pattern and show how it's actually laid out all over the world with all these ancient cultures and the origins of this knowledge. So let's hand it over here to Marshall and jump into, what do you mean fundamental pattern? What are you talking about?
Great, thanks, Jamie. I'm going to share my screen to get started with this. Probably seeing the infinite video feedback coming in right now.
How holofractographic.
Yeah, there it is. It's always available. Good, I think it's going to work. Should be seeing the black screen right now. This is where it all begins, of course. Yeah, so I'm going to just take us through a very brief introduction about the fundamental pattern aspect of unified physics, and then Jamie will take it into how it relates to ancient cultures and ancient origins. So it's important to understand this aspect both in terms of for the physics itself as well as for how it relates to this topic, that looking back in our cultural history to see, well, maybe this was known a long time ago. So I begin in the near ancient origins in the distant 20th century. And my journey and also this presentation begins with this guy right here, Buckminster Fuller. I became a Fuller back in 1978, and I got to meet him in 1979, and have been studying his work since then. And for anybody that knows about Bucky, that's an unending topic of exploration. It was so vast what he did. And if you don't know about Buckminster Fuller, definitely check him out. You can visit bfi.org, the Buckminster Fuller Institute, bfi.org, and learn all about Bucky there and get some of his books. But the reason I begin with Bucky is because his research is foundational to what I discovered, and when I met Nassim, back around in 1999-2000. He was the first person that was referencing the same fundamental ideas that came from Bucky Fuller. So I'm going to share some of that with you. And what Bucky did was he really studied nature's coordinate system. He'd look at all these different structures and patterns in nature, and he developed a system of describing that coordinate system that he called synergetics, and mapped it out in just an incredible 2-volume books that are just so deep in this geometry, synergetic geometry. And he would then model that in 3D to be able to actually make physical examples of what he was studying and researching. And then he put it into application in things like the geodesic dome and this most famous example here, which is called Spaceship Earth at the Epcot Center. And you can see here this beautiful geometric spherical symmetry that Bucky really is the inventor of. And one thing to note is that when we consider the fundamental pattern in relationship to the physics and the surface of a proton, really, in order to have curvature, you have to have the same kind of geodesic triangulation. And so really, we can look at this pattern and then equate it to what we're exploring later when we look at how that relates to the physics. One of Bucky's great quotes is, "Love is metaphysical gravity." And I just wanted to add this in because it shows that this man really cared so deeply, and he had devoted his entire life to what one person could do on behalf of all humanity and all life to make it work. And so he's equating this metaphysical experience of love with the physical experience of gravity, this attractive bonding force. Now, this is just going to cut to the chase. I'm really going to go very simple here. Bucky Fuller discovered a fundamental geometry and in 1940 he named it the vector equilibrium, and he called it the zero phase of conceptual integrity. The zero phase meaning at the center of all oscillation of vibrations in the universe, there's always a zero phase when that waveform goes to zero. And this geometry describes that moment in a geometric arrangement. So it looks like this for those who aren't familiar with it. And he studied a lot of what he developed in synergetics by packing spheres together. Closest packing of spheres, it's called. And so if you take one sphere in the center, you can pack then 12 equal-sized spheres around it and connect all of those center points, which are all equidistant from each other, and then connect all those around with each other. You get this geometric symmetry here, and this is what he called the vector equilibrium, because all of the vectors from the center out and all of the vectors around the outside are all the same length. It's the only geometry that does this. The other geometries that have the same length vectors on the outside have different length vectors going to the center. So they're not in the same total equilibrium state. So that's why he called it the vector equilibrium. He has a couple of very nice quotes that describe its role in the universe. He said, "The vector equilibrium is absolutely dead center of universe and will never be seen by man in any physical experience, yet it is the frame of reference, and it is not in rotation, and it is sizeless and timeless." So you can see right there, all the things we equate with the universe, size, time, rotation, are all referenced by this equilibrium zero phase state. He also said the vector equilibrium is the zero starting point for happenings and non-happenings. It is the empty theater, an empty circus, an empty universe ready to accommodate any act and any audience. I just love that. It's the pure potential, what he's describing here, that exists throughout the entire universe, ready to come into manifestation. So in extending this idea of sphere packing, Bucky then extended the symmetry of the vector equilibrium into what's called an isotropic vector matrix. And you can see the sphere packing extending out, adding layers, still maintaining that vector equilibrium shape, but adding more and more dimension to it, or more layers. And so here's an example of the isotropic vector matrix. You can see that seed vector equilibrium and all the vectors then extending out from it. So isotropic means the same everywhere. Vectors are lines of energy. Matrix is a pattern of energy. So this is a pattern of energy vectors that are the same length and angular relationship and are therefore in perfect equilibrium. You can imagine this vector array extending infinitely out in all directions. It can just be present everywhere. And in fact, in the model of unified physics that we're going to touch into, that is the case. And the vector equilibrium itself scales fractally throughout this. And so you have this octave scaling. It doubles in size as it gets larger. This octave scaling of the same pattern fractally present throughout the entire scaling of the universe. So the fractal nature is right at the heart of all this. This is a great animation that the animator for the Thrive movie did, showing what this might look like. I hope it comes through for you guys enough to get a feel for it. But this is what this matrix could look like when we imagine it within these different geometries inherent in it. And you can see how atomic and crystalline structures are inherently in this kind of a geometry. This is another one that just gives another feel for it. So you can get a sense of this infinite array that can be present throughout the entire cosmos within these localized kind of crystalline gravitational tensegrity structures embedded within it and coming from in it into manifestation. So the isotropic vector matrix itself is comprised of adjacent tetrahedron and octahedron. You can see the blue tetrahedron and the red octahedron alternating in this matrix. This is relevant to this topic tonight because some of what Jamie will touch into with the pyramidal structures around the world relates directly to this octahedral form, because the pyramids are half an octahedron in their geometry. So here it is related to this fundamental matrix. Now what Nassim was interested in doing was, because there were these octahedral cavities in between the tetrahedron, he wanted to come up with what would be a balanced symmetry that would be all tetrahedron. So you wouldn't have these cavities of octahedron between the tetrahedron, because the tetrahedron is the most basic structural form in the universe. And so he really worked on this for a long time, and there are many movies and presentations about his journey to discover this 64 tetrahedron matrix. But I just want to share this animation that's from the Thrive film. And if you haven't seen Thrive, it's a great film that you can check out at thrivemovement.com. So here showing the 8 tetrahedron that point inward towards the center, that make up this vector equilibrium shape. And a little toroidal flow around it, that is the fundamental dynamic flow pattern. Here's an octave scaling of that up to the next level of the vector equilibrium. And now we start to see the tetrahedron that make up the 64 tetrahedron. The different polarities. There are 32 upward facing and 32 downward facing that make up the 64 tetrahedron matrix, the balance of symmetry. And in this animation, then those tetrahedron become spheres. And this is important when we get to the unified physics, because that's the actual dynamic flow pattern. The geometry of the tetrahedron is really the relationship geometry. It's not like there are tetrahedron and vectors, you know, structurally down there in the universe. They're tensegrity, gravity relationships of actually spherical entities. So it looks a bit like this. And this, of course, maybe you can see already, is actually very reminiscent of a symbol that we see in ancient cultures that Jamie's going to touch into, called the flower of life. And here's just a few examples of it that I'm sure Jamie will be talking more about. But you can see, you know, it's been around for a long time in many different cultures, and, you know, beautifully represented as mosaics and floors and tile patterns. Even Da Vinci has it in his sketchbook. So, you know, it's been really known of and represented for centuries and millennia. So another way of seeing how this fundamental pattern relates to that flower of life symmetry. Hey, Jamie, I think I'll get you to mute. I think that might be you. So I'm hearing some background noise. Mute your audio. Is to see, here we have this vector equilibrium again. And here are the 12 basic points. These different colors are the 6 equal and opposite vectors that make it up. So we have these 12 points. And if we add 12 more of those to each of those points, now we're adding vector equilibrium into this isotropic vector matrix to start getting an extended symmetry. It starts to make this really beautiful, kind of like a Sri Yantra, very balanced Sri Yantra kind of a pattern here. Now we just overlay this flower of life, and we can see, at least in the two-dimensional representation, here it is. This is this beautiful, basic, hexagonal, triangulated symmetry that is fundamental to the isotropic vector matrix and to the ground state that we're going to talk about in unified physics. And we have the vector equilibrium geometry inherent in it, scaling up, octave scaling, as well as the 64 tetrahedron matrix that Nassim developed. So there it is, kind of all simply in one fundamental geometry pattern. Now this is just a really nice animation. One of our delegate students named Andy Day from the UK, beautiful 3D animator, I had him make this nice animation that shows actually that the 64 tetrahedron matrix is really just taking the vector equilibrium and polarizing it by taking those 8 basic tetrahedron and making them into dual tetrahedron, which is essentially polarizing them. Now you have the 64 tetrahedron grid. So what Nassim did is actually represent the balanced symmetry of the polarized isotropic vector matrix at the next level from the fundamental basic vector equilibrium state. So that's how these two relate. And you can see the orange vector equilibrium with the 8 tetrahedron pointing inward, the contractive force of the universe. And then the green dual tetrahedron pointing outward, which is the radiative aspect of energy dynamics. So that's the balanced wholeness of those two at the basic level. So I'm just going to do a quick little equating this to unified physics to see how this fundamental pattern works in that context. So here again we have this sort of three-dimensional flower of life array of these little spheres. In the unified physics model, each of these little spheres is called a Planck spherical unit because their diameter is the diameter of the Planck length, which is 10 to the minus 35 meters. It's so tiny that it's really inconceivable. It's vastly smaller than the diameter of a proton, radius of a proton, for example. So, it is really the most fundamental natural unit that Max Planck derived that is foundational to all of the physics that has been explored since he derived this, and is foundational to our understanding of unified physics. And again, it's a natural unit, not a contrived one to kind of make an equation work. It comes from observation and measuring of natural phenomena. So this Planck spherical units are these tiny little electromagnetic oscillators with a Planck length diameter. Here you can see this little dual torus animation. So we can imagine this as not little like balls, but electromagnetic spherical oscillators, as tiny as you could possibly conceive of at the Planck scale. So just seeing how this relates to the theory of unified physics, just a quick exploration. So beginning with using the mass-energy equation that's so familiar, we can derive a mass of the PSU Planck spherical unit of 10 to the minus 5 grams. So each of those tiny little oscillations, electromagnetic oscillations, deriving from energy to mass is 10 to the minus 5 grams. Very small amount of mass energy. So when you fill a cubic centimeter with these little oscillations, you get a very high energy density of the vacuum, 10 to the 94 grams per cubic centimeter. It's 10 with 94 zeros following. It's a huge number. It's absolutely vast and inconceivable. And this is even in standard physics, not just unified physics. This is the vacuum energy density calculation when you renormalize the values to have some limit, because otherwise it just goes to infinity. You get this huge number. Well, to give that kind of a perspective for those who aren't familiar with this, when you take all of the matter that's known in the universe, all of the galaxies and stars and energy, and calculate that total amount, that's 10 to the 55 grams. That's basically the estimated mass of the universe, which is all the protons and matter combined. Well, when you compare that with the vacuum energy density, the vacuum energy is 39 orders of magnitude greater than the entire known universal energy matter, you know, in its totality. So it's just vast, and this is key because it's foundational to our understanding of how to work with the holographic mass in unified physics. So we have these electromagnetic oscillators that are all space filling. And what we mean by that is, going back to Buckminster Fuller, he worked with the spherical geometry in tangent, touching each other but not overlapping, like we saw with these illustrations here. And what Nassim realized is that he needed to have it all space filling, so rather than try to figure out how to fill those kind of triangular tetrahedral gaps in between them, instead he just made them overlap enough to be all space filling. And of course energy can do this. We see this with standing wave patterns in water and you know, electromagnetism, etc. This is an electromagnetic field and dynamic energy flow. So you can see this intersecting interference pattern kind of arrangement. Now think of this as just a very you know, equilibrious array, this isotropic vector matrix array of this fundamental oscillation pattern is what the basic ground state is in this model at the Planck scale, these little electromagnetic oscillators in that kind of an overlapping array. So here's that kind of a simple image of what that might look like. And what Nassim did then was to take that packing of those little oscillators and put them into a proton diameter. Say, how many would fit into the diameter of a proton? Well, the total is approximately 10 to 60 of those. And so then when you calculate that many by the mass of the Planck spherical unit, that's 10 to the 60 times 10 to the minus 5 grams, well, you get 10 to the 55 grams, which is a familiar number we just saw. It's actually equal to the mass of the universe. And so we have an equivalence between the interior of a proton and the mass energy density that is made up of this fundamental kind of ground state Planck spherical unit matrix, and the exterior of the proton, which is the rest of the universe. And you can begin to see the value being the same suggests a equilibrium between the inner, what's called the holographic mass, and the outer cosmological mass that we know as the universe. So each proton in this can be seen as connected to all the protons holographically. That's what's called the holographic mass. They're actually connected to each other, so the same value that's external is represented internally. And being holographic, the information of the whole is present everywhere, meaning that within each proton is the information of every other proton, so that there's a holographic, unified information matrix. William Brown described that beautifully in the last Channel 64. So that's a very simplistic representation of the holographic mass, the generalized holographic principle that is in the unified physics theory that Nassim has developed. And just to extend this a couple more levels here, the tiling of the equators of these PSUs on the surface of the proton, you can see has the same kind of a flower of life pattern, or a triangulated geodesic kind of a pattern. And when you calculate the relationship between the ratio between the PSUs on the surface and the number on the inside, what Nassim has been able to derive is a very accurate value, probably the most accurate value for the proton rest mass. That's the basic measured mass of a proton. His calculation is very close to the most recent calculations, which are actually converging towards the number he got through this geometric derivation and mathematical derivation. So this also applies to the cosmological scale as well, meaning that you can take the same kind of internal and surface ratio relationship and come up with the mass of a star or a planet and galaxies, things like that. This animation also from Andy Day is just really beautiful. Nassim had him create this. This shows the jitterbugging of the vector equilibrium, this dynamic pulsation that the vector equilibrium can do in this overlapping array, which then extends out, and we start to see this spherical oscillating on the surface. And you can even see that little point in the middle, that five-pointed thing, would be the geodesic icosahedral geometry. And then pulling this out even farther, we can imagine then something like a proton just having such a high resolution of this. This is still even crude because this would be covered with Planck scale little oscillators. And so essentially this would be what a proton surface may be like. And as well, it actually looks very similar to some of the images we see of the sun. So again, the same idea applies to the cosmological scale. The same ratio relationship can be used to calculate mass, energy, density, things like that, geometrically at all scales, from the proton scale all the way up to the stars and universe, etc. So the last little bit of information about Nassim's theory relevant to this discussion tonight is that it also mathematically proves that the strong force that holds protons together in the nucleus of an atom is a consequence of quantum gravity. So he shows that the same energetic relationship that we know at the cosmological scale as gravity can mathematically describe this, what's been called the strong force, because there hasn't been an understanding of where it's coming from, and it hasn't been able to make sense that it was actually gravitational. But if you haven't done the delegate program, when you go through that, all the information is there, Nassim's paper is there, the mathematics is there to be able to explore how this is actually so. And so with that, he's been able to unify all the forces, which is why we call this unified physics. So that's a quick little hit on the basic fundamental pattern, the isotropic vector matrix, and the vector equilibrium, and how that relates to the fundamental ground state of the Planck spherical units, etc. And then it scales up into the proton and matter and us and everything else. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jamie Janover, and he'll take us into some of the ancient origins of how we can see that perhaps this was actually known a long time ago. So take it away, Jamie.
Awesome, Marshall. Great work. It's a challenge to convey that specificity in such a short time. So thanks for downloading us with the fundamental pattern aspect. So yeah, we have this geometric structure to the one thing that is everywhere, no matter where you go, which is space itself. If you asked yourself, what is the one thing that connects all things? Some people might say, you know, it's God or light or love or something like that. But the real mechanics of it is that space is everywhere you go. At the quantum scale and the cosmological scale, space is there. And Nassim asked the question, what is space and what is it made of, and is there a structure to it? And when he investigated that, he got to these very specific geometries. And these geometries, creating a perfect vector equilibrium in space, cancels out this incredibly dense amount of energy that we experience as quantum vacuum fluctuations at the Planck scale. And it's so much energy, you can see that there's the mass of the universe in a proton. Well, how come I can move my hand? I don't feel anything. The answer is that the space is in a perfect state of balance, a vector equilibrium, as first discovered by Mr. Fuller, creating what we call space, and we think of it as empty, but it's actually full. And it's called the plenum, the ether, space, the vacuum, God, the source field, chi, mana. You could call it whatever you want, different cultures. We're bathing in and made of an infinitely dense superfluid medium that we call space, and it's not random. It has a very specific tensegrity structure to it, which we just saw, and this was figured out using modern techniques. Nassim and Buckminster Fuller are, you know, in modern times, and they were using, in some cases, highly advanced technological devices that could measure things like black holes at the cosmological scale and make measurements of it, and derive through the scientific method a hypothesis that says maybe this is the structure of space-time. And then when they derived what it was, it turned out to perfectly match this fundamental pattern that we see in ancient cultures all around the world. So now I'm about to go into this infinite zoom world as well as I share my screen on this keynote here. Oh wow, I'm like giving away serious juice of later on. So here's the fundamental pattern, right? On the left, you have Nassim-Haramein's 64 tetrahedron grid pattern, which is basically 64 tetrahedrons with a sphere around each tetrahedron, and they overlap each other to form these petal shapes. And it's a three-dimensional structure, but if you were to try to simplify this three-dimensional structure and basically shine a light through it and make a shadow onto a two-dimensional surface, you would come up with this symbol that we've all seen a million times called the flower of life. And so this
Jamie.
is... Yes?
I don't think you pressed play and go into presentation mode. Did you do that yet?
Oh, sorry.
Okay,
I was looking
great.
at it first. So here's Nassim's 64 tetrahedron grid with the spheres around it. And here's the Egyptian symbol. And when I first saw this, I just thought, you know, there's no way this could be a coincidence. That the Egyptians just happened to draw a pretty picture that matched the exact geometry that was derived by a unified field theorist using the scientific method and modern technology in 2002 or whatever. That seemed very remote to me. So the question instantly becomes, how did these Egyptians know about this pattern? And is this pattern anywhere else? The most famous example, you've probably heard about this, in the movie Thrive, which many of you have probably seen, or even if you haven't seen the movie, even in the trailer for Thrive, you see Nassim talk about this flower of life symbol showing up here at this site in Egypt. This is the Osirian Temple in Abydos, not far from the Nile Valley. And you can see there are these gigantic blocks. In some cases, they're 100 tons. And they didn't just move these blocks. They had to place them perfectly in alignment. And you'll see right above this guy's head here that they're sitting tongue and groove. They had to lower these blocks down on top of the other blocks. You see in red there, that means they're not just moving blocks, they're actually lowering blocks. And now, right away, there's a big issue, right? Because what we were told when we were in school, at least I remember this vividly, is that human beings evolved from more primitive Homo sapiens and hominids, and then they slowly but surely developed more complex ideas and structures and tools and things like this. And eventually, something like 10,000 to 12,000 years ago or something like that, we came crawling out of our caves and kind of being hunter-gatherers to start to form more complex society structures and do things like making tools and farming and early societal kind of structures. And so that 10,000 years ago, we were supposedly not very highly advanced, yet if this was made around the time that they think the pyramids were made or something like this, thousands of years ago, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago, mankind was supposedly not that technologically advanced. If we tried to build this today, we'd have a serious problem. And what do you find on the side of this giant block? There it is, the flower of life symbol. that is somehow on the side of the rock. And now there's a big debate about this, right? Nassim in the Trailer to Thrive says that this is perhaps laser etched, or that it was burned into the rock, because the atomic structure of the rock seems to have been altered. Some people would claim that this is red ochre, and there is graffiti on the side of the other side of this column that's red ochre, that's much larger font, if you will. The lines are much thicker, it's much cruder, and this one is geometrically perfect, and it hasn't eroded off of the rock in thousands of years. You can see later Greek graffiti above it. It's rather difficult to get good shots of this. You have to kind of bribe the guards to get this close. You can see in this picture there's some smaller circles up there, but the question remains, why did they make this pattern, and how did it get here, and who put it there? This one, you can see that there's a double line around the outside, kind of like a corpus callosum of a cell. Nassim would say that this is kind of encoding it, that this is not the complete flower. This is a flower of life that's been cut off by that circle, because this information has been encoded. It seems like this information has been around for a long time, but perhaps it's been hidden by the people who really understood what this pattern meant and what it did. And here's the thing, it's not just on the side of the rock in Egypt. This symbol, the flower of life, is found all over the world, from Turkey and Bulgaria to China and Egypt and Australia to Leonardo da Vinci's drawings. We see this pattern showing up all over the place. This is a piece of art, I believe, from Finland. Here we have some coins with this motif on it, I believe from Persia, Middle East. This is an ancient helmet with this pattern on it. You see the same flower of life pattern here in India, and this is I believe on a box or something like that from Japan. So you're finding it all over the place. This is, I think, somewhere in the Middle East, another pattern. This is a site in Turkey. You can see this beautiful mosaic down there. So basically just showing that this flower of life pattern is pretty much universal. It even shows up in Western church designs that are much later than the examples I was just showing you, and in other artifacts that are made of gold and patterning and silk weavings. It's all over the place. Even Stonehenge has been laid out that in a way that maps to a flower of life patterning. So this fundamental pattern called the flower of life is now omnipresent. We even see it in commercials, and I saw it at Target on the background of the specials aisle. They had flower of life patterning paper that was, you know, part of their marketing. So I mean, it's really everywhere, and that's great because it is the most foundational pattern in the universe. It's spheres that are overlapping each other, perfectly space-filling with no gaps, where these waveforms are actually interacting with each other, forming these little petal shapes that are 3D Vesica Pisces. The Vesica Pisces you might think of as like the little eyeball kind of shape, but it's actually a three-dimensional structure. There's a guy named Michael Evans who thinks of this as the sixth Platonic solid. Although it's not straight-lined, it's a three-sided solid, starting with a point, going into a petal, and then ending in a point. And this is a very foundational pattern. This is the pattern that Marshall was describing for the way that Planck spherical units, tiny, tiny little vibrations, overlap each other to make up the structure of a proton. There's 10 to the 60 Planck spherical units inside of a proton, and that is so many. They're so small. The only way to really visualize it is imagine if you took 10 to the 60 little Planck spherical units and you made them the size of a grain of sand. 10 to the 60 grains of sand would mean the diameter of your proton was from here to Alpha Centauri, about 4 light years away. So we're talking unbelievably small little vibrations forming this flower of life lattice. And the spheres are centered by a lattice of geometry being a tetrahedral array. So it's both tetrahedrons and spheres, and you have to remember that this is holofractographic, meaning it's a hologram and it's a fractal, and so it's not just one scale of this pattern, it's this scale inside of this scale inside of this scale nested to infinity in both directions, meaning infinitely large to infinitely small. We see the same field patterning happening in a proton as we do in much larger structures. This is an image by Charles L. Gilchrist called the Glyph Maker, and it shows 3 resolutions of flower of life tiling pattern over the top of each other. The same kind of thing here in blue. And so it's about the tetrahedrons and the spheres coming together. You kind of need the male and the female to create our reality. And that's more of a, a metaphor. It's not literal, but you could think of the spheres as more feminine, and you could think of the geometry as more linear or male, or the other way around if you want. But the point is you need both the geometry and the spheres coming together to form this fundamental pattern that is the structure of everything. Now again, how did the ancients know this? Here's the Egyptians. Nassim, when he first started looking into this, when he was first coming up with the idea of the vector equilibrium, he was studying Buckminster Fuller's work. He's thought, man, I have to figure out what geometry could possibly exist that would cancel out all of the energy that's in the quantum vacuum so that it appears to us to be empty even though it's perfectly full. So I have to figure out a perfectly symmetrical geometry on all scales. When he came to Chichen Itza and he saw how organized this thing was and how the shadow was casting a snake image on the staircase during the equinox, he thought whoever built this pyramid thousands of years ago knew a lot about geometry. So he looked into ancient Mayan pyramids initially, and he came across Teotihuacan. This is about 100 kilometers from Mexico City. And at the end of the career of this guy, Peter Tompkins, who studied this city for about 30 years, here's the Pyramid of the Sun, he said that what the Mayans were trying to tell us is about the relationship of a sphere and a tetrahedron. If you put a sphere, tetrahedron inside of a sphere, it intersects exactly at 19.47 degrees latitude. So Nassim started looking into tetrahedrons and the work of Peter Tompkins. Interestingly, the Big Island of Hawaii is at this latitude, as well as Angkor Wat and other power spots on the Earth, and not just on our sphere. On other spheres in the solar system, you see structures at 19.47, like the big red spot on Jupiter. Now we have these great high-resolution images. Interestingly, that red spot's been shrinking lately. I don't know if you heard that. This is the most recent images that have come out. But as long as we've been observing Jupiter, about 350 years, this spot has been 19.47 degrees. We also see increased sunspot activity on the Sun at this latitude. This is the latitude, north or south, where a star tetrahedron would intersect a sphere. So we see evidence of this fundamental pattern from the star to the proton. We also see these weird vortices on our planet where anomalies happen, like the Bermuda Triangle, which is exactly at 19.47. So is the Devil's Triangle and all these other anomalies in both the northern and southern hemisphere. Now we're seeing that there's commonalities between cultures that are very far apart from each other that all have the same patterning and the same geometry being expressed through their monuments, their documents, and even in some cases their practices. For example, you've got the Great Pyramid of Giza, which actually is not the pyramid in this one. That's the middle pyramid. But the Pyramid of the Sun at the below part of this image and the Great Pyramid of Giza are only 3% different in their area of their base. And you can see them overlapping here. Very close. They have a different angle to them, but similar base. I was fortunate enough to go to Egypt myself in 2012. Actually December of 2012. This picture I took, I think, on December 19th, 2012. This is the Great Pyramid of Giza, and let's just review, shall we, real quickly, the stories that we were all taught in school. I remember it vividly. I was in 6th grade. Mr. Locascio was my teacher, and he said, we're going to learn about the Egyptians today. And so he started telling us about how there was a pharaoh that ruled Egypt, and he only would probably be pharaoh for 20 years because you became pharaoh when you were maybe 25, and then you died when you were 45 in those days. And so he had 20 years to build his tomb, and so he got all of his slaves together, maybe 100,000 of them, to carve these blocks out of a limestone quarry 100 miles away, and then drag them across the sand with vine ropes, or maybe rolled them on logs or something like this, and put them on a boat, brought them down the Nile, and proceeded to stack 2,330,000 two-ton stones so perfectly that when they put the final stone on the top, it was only a centimeter off the axis of the base, which is 13 acres. And if you tried to recreate this pyramid right now with all of the technology that we had available to us today, you couldn't do it. And yet, here this thing stands. This is probably the best example that we have. It's the only great wonder of the world that's still surviving, of highly advanced technology that was used by someone at some point to make this thing. Because a skeptic can stand there and you say, is this here? They have to say yes. And then you say, well, how did this get here? And they can try to describe as much as you want, but you know, people like Graham Hancock, who made this slide right here, as you can see, are questioning the same thing, because supposedly Khufu built this thing and the only statue we can find of him is 3 inches tall. Don't you think if you were Khufu and you spent your entire life making this thing, that you would have a sign or a marking or something indicating that you built this? There's no hieroglyphs on this structure at all. It's just mysterious, incredibly mysterious. There's actually 6 pyramids. The Great Pyramid is the one that's the farthest away in this picture. There's 3 small ones and 3 big ones. This is the middle pyramid. It has a little bit of a capstone left on it. Originally, these pyramids were totally smooth, covered in an alabaster limestone coating that the Egyptians later mined so that they could make their temples in Cairo. The pyramids also actually used to be much closer to the Nile River. The Nile has moved quite a bit over time, and that could be an indication of just how old these pyramids are, because you can look geologically at how long it takes for a river like the Nile to change its course, and you can see that the Nile's changed a lot over time. Even here in old photographs, you can see the Nile's much closer than it is right now. The question is, though, how did they manage to put this together? There's this incredibly large base on this very large piece of bedrock. It's strong enough to hold the pyramid. When the first white Western male explorer came, he did what any good white male would do when he didn't know how to find the door for something. He pulled out dynamite and, believe it or not, blew a hole in the side of the Great Pyramid. You actually don't go through the big hole in this picture. You go where those people are in the lower right, and you can walk in there, and you'll see that there are chambers in there, the King's and Queen's chamber, and there are specific angles to these that are half the degrees of the outside of the pyramid. But again, there's hieroglyphs everywhere all over Egypt that describe everything from familial relationships to the gods to harvesting crops. Even going to the bathroom and having sex have been described in hieroglyphs. Don't you think that if you built the coolest building ever built in the history of humankind, you might just make a hieroglyph like, oh yeah, by the way, that was us, and here's how we built it? No evidence has been found of hieroglyphs showing the building of the Great Pyramid, and it gets more and more mysterious. I highly recommend several different ways of looking into this. There's all kinds of books about the Great Pyramid. There's also a great TV show called The Pyramid Code you can check out. The mysteries of the pyramids, and there's a lot of great pages and stuff related to it. This is one of my favorite images. This one shows that, you know, when you look at a rainbow, it's always at a certain angle from the angle that you're looking. So a rainbow is dependent on your personal perspective of the light compared to where the rain and the clouds are. And that would be 42 degrees for a single rainbow, and between 50 and 53 degrees for a double rainbow, and those are the exact angles of inclination of the edge and the face of the Great Pyramid. And it doesn't stop there. That pyramid is encoding so much information. On the winter solstice, the south side of the Great Pyramid is absolutely perfectly perpendicular to the sun. I don't think that's a coincidence. It's actually an 8-sided pyramid that you can only see from the air on certain days when the shadow is just right. That is not a coincidence either. That is very difficult to achieve. The question is, what is the real purpose of the Great Pyramids? It's something that we're still trying to answer, and it's something I'm going to return to, because I want to move on to other aspects of Egypt here. You've got the Sphinx, we've all seen a million times. The Sphinx has got a smaller head than the body, and the erosion is different, and the color is different. And this perhaps used to look like a dog or a cat, and a pharaoh came along and found this statue and recarved it to look like him. And this is up for debate, obviously. Classic Egyptologists would say that the Sphinx was built around the same time as the pyramids, which they think is approximately 5,500 years ago. When they first discovered it, it was buried in sand. I always love imagining coming across this in the early days before Western explorers came. Here's the British in the late 1800s. Again, the British and some friends. I love the Sphinx. It was really awesome to get to go there and experience it. I actually was able to stand in between the paws of the Sphinx as the sun rose on December 21st, 2012. So I will always have a connection to this this great object and the whole site. This is the temple of the Sphinx. At the foot of the Sphinx are these 100-ton blocks. How are you pulling around 100-ton blocks and stacking them like Legos when you're at a low level of evolution of technology? It seems like there's a big disconnect between the standard model of archaeology, if you will, and what we're actually observing. These giant blocks being carved out from the side of the Sphinx, and then you look at the encasement around the Sphinx, and you see that erosion on the wall. Well, Robert Schoch, who's a geologist who's at Boston University, took a look at this and did a study many years ago and figured out that that erosion has to have been caused by water due to rainfall, and he knew that there wasn't enough rainfall in the last 5,500 years to cause that level of erosion, so he dared to suggest that the Sphinx is a lot older than commonly thought in Egyptology. And he said he wanted to present his ideas, and his colleagues welcomed him and put him at a headliner as a big conference, and it was kind of a setup. He said, I think that the Sphinx might be 10,000 years old. He wanted to say 30,000 years old, but he didn't dare say that because he was already doubling the age, and he didn't want to get too far away from the standard model, or else you get up against a lot of resistance. I find that there's a commonality here between people like Robert Schoch and Graham Hancock, changing the paradigm of the way we look at ancient origins of humanity in a similar way that Nassim took a look at physics and changed the foundations of the standard model by questioning some of the assumptions that were made early on. I have a feeling early Egyptologists kind of came to a conclusion, and it's been hard to change that story. In other words, if you want to get a PhD in Egyptology, you can't go around and say, I think the Sphinx wasn't made by the pharaoh in 5,500 years ago. I think it's 30,000 years old. Well, that seems to be the case in terms of the evidence that we find. Also, by the way, you might not know, there's a trap door in the back of the Sphinx, and there's chambers that go underneath the Sphinx. Edgar Cayce predicted that there was a Hall of Records in there. They've done famous things on television where they said we're going to drill in there and try to find it, and it drove Robert Schoch and those guys insane that Zahi Hawass, who was the head of Egyptology department at the time, dug at an angle to purposely miss this chamber and all this stuff. But now, fast forward to like last week practically, I think this was 2 weeks ago, they're doing infrared thermography on the pyramid, and they found heat anomalies right at the base of the pyramid, and they're going to be doing these studies over the next couple of years. So it's pretty exciting. Now finally we're starting to see some motion, and other technologies are being used to try to investigate how these things were built. Now, the pyramids in Egypt and the pyramids in Mexico are probably the most famous pyramids, but there are pyramids all over the world, and a pyramid is not a tetrahedron. A pyramid is a stellated or cut off octahedron, and when we are looking at the structure of space-time being made of those tetrahedrons and octahedrons, this is the geometry of the resonating cavities that's formed by a tetrahedral array. So this basic geometry is very much directly related to the geometry of the fabric of the vacuum. And man, we see pyramids of all different styles and shapes and sizes all over the planet, from Egypt and China and Iraq and Sudan to Mexico and Bosnia. And they're found, literally spaced evenly around the world. I guess there's not a ton in Australia, but maybe there will be some discovered there someday. These pyramids are found in Sudan, really beautiful and different angle than the other ones. I don't know a ton about these, but I think they have to be tied in. Here's a pyramid in Peru in the middle of the city. And here's a Chinese pyramid. This picture was taken by a pilot who had gotten lost in World War II and came back reporting seeing Chinese pyramids. It wasn't until much later that Western explorers went into the interior of China and discovered these pyramids. The Chinese government told farmers to farm on there to help disguise the pyramids, and they even planted these prickly bushes on the pyramids themselves so that it would be much more difficult to excavate. So I think there's some level of resistance to even letting Western archaeologists explore these sites. But now, thanks to modern technology and people like tourists and drones and all this, we're starting to see these images like this one coming out of China. This is another pyramid also in China, and here's some more pyramids in China, again with these very prickly bushes purposely planted on the surface of them so that you can't easily get there. Now, the work of Robert Hancock and Robert Bauval, they've done several books on the subject. I highly encourage you to check those out. Here's an aerial shot of the Chinese pyramids. You can see they have a very specific arrangement, the way they're laid out, and it just happens to perfectly match the way that Giza and Teotihuacan are laid out, and it's also matching the orientation of the 3 stars in the Belt of Orion constellation. Now, this could be a coincidence, but I don't think so. The more you stack all these coincidences together, the less likely that they're all coincidences. Beyond a reasonable doubt has been achieved in my mind looking at all the evidence. It keeps getting more amazing. Look at how these 3 sites that I just showed you actually line up in that same orientation on the surface of the Earth. I doubt this is a coincidence. It's too perfectly set up for all this to be a coincidence. And look how far apart these sites are. Now, supposedly, you know, ancient peoples of the Earth, before they invented modern technology, they couldn't communicate over long distances, right? Like Columbus didn't quote unquote discover America until 1492. Man, we have a long way to go to changing the story of what actually happened and telling kids about it. Unfortunately, here in the United States of America, we still celebrate this thing called Columbus Day as if Columbus was the first guy to come to the United States, even though there was all these people here already, and those people walked across the bridge from not just from Alaska and Russia. They've now figured out that there was a land bridge that went from the United Kingdom and Iceland to Greenland to North America, and they walked that way too, and that's only about a couple months old. So here's the evidence showing you this alignments of these pyramids and the exact distances and the heights and the perimeters. There's all kinds of data on this stuff. And it doesn't stop there. The commonalities of structures between cultures is all over the planet. And you never really normally think, I don't think, of Cambodia and Guatemala being, you know, commonalities between them, but look at these structures and how similar they are, and it goes on and on. You can see in statues from around the world, like at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which I'm going to talk about in more in depth here, and sites in Indonesia and Easter Island, that all these statues have the same kind of features, the same hand positions with the fingers and all this stuff, and they're again very far apart from each other. We see the same commonalities in structures in Bulgaria, Machu Picchu, Hungary, and Peru. We see stonework that's incredibly detailed, giant megalithic stones that would be very hard to move and then fit together absolutely perfectly all over the world, from Bolivia and Peru to places in Europe and in Greece. This is the work of Richard Casero. He has a great book called Written in Stone that reviews a lot of these commonalities. We have the same kind of thing happening in symbolism. All these statues that are holding feathers or serpents or staves in their hands, similar around the world. This is showing how Peru and Egypt have very similar geometric shapes in the foundations of their iconography, that there's a commonality between Egypt and Ecuador that is very specific. If you look at the sun disc on top of the head and the headdress, the position of the hand, all of these very specific things, like the snake coming down, looking out of the third eye there, can't be a coincidence that these cultures just both happen to choose to make these images exactly like this. Ecuador and Mesopotamia. This shows that there was probably some common culture that was influencing all these various places around the world. Balinese and Mayan designs also very similar. Balinese and Mayan pyramids, the gargoyle kind of like dragon-looking folks there, the triptych, which is those three doorways. So how is it we're getting these step pyramids that look the same with the triptych doorways that look the same? Does this mean that there was one culture that gave birth to all these cultures? It looks like that's possible, right? When you check out these images, you can get more and more mysterious the more you look into it. It's not just the pyramids and the triptych. It's also these gabled arches. It's the process of mummification. Mummification is not only in Egypt. It's found around the world. This is a great slide. I think I don't know if this is connected or not, but it's a great observation that in the Last Supper, Leonardo da Vinci, there's the same triptych in the background. You know, this could just be taking it too far, I'm not sure, but I threw this in because I really personally think this is classic. Whoever figured this out, I love this slide. And here it is again, right? This is in South America, and look at the size of these. And this is in the Middle East. Again, gigantic triptych doorways. So we have all these sites around the world placed practically even around the planet that are all in perfect alignment, all with similar structures, and then you've got similar practices like mummification in Egypt, you've got mummification in China. You have the Sphinx in Egypt and you have the Fu Dog in China. The Fu Dog, just like the Sphinx, is supposed to be the protector of the information, the guardian of the knowledge, if you will. So what's this guy guarding? This is the Fu Dog at the entrance to the Forbidden City in Beijing, China, and he's one of the biggest Fu Dogs in China. But what's he actually guarding? Not just the entrance. What does he have under his paw? He has a proton. He has the PSU Flower of Life tiling pattern sphere under his paw. Now that could be a coincidence, but again, I just don't think so. The Chinese and the Egyptians and the Mayans all are encoding not just a flat Flower of Life, they're encoding a 3D version of a model of the Planck spherical units that make up the quantum vacuum inside of a proton. I assume they didn't have like quantum microscopes back in the day when they were building this statue. I was very fortunate to actually get to go to this site as well. I've been doing these presentations for a long time, and so I always show other people's photos of this stuff. I really wanted to go and take this photo and finally have my own picture of this structure. I got to go there on my way home from a trip to India and New Zealand and Australia this past year. And so here I am with my selfie stick leaning over the railing so I could get the camera up close enough to get that shot. And if you look, the pedestal that this Fu Dog is sitting on also has this same kind of tiling pattern and geometric lattice work. Here's another like fisheye version of that same Fu Dog. So we see the same geometry encoded in Egypt as we do here in China, and this is another site within the Forbidden City. I had never seen this before. We were in the gardens at the back of the Forbidden City on the way out near the end of the day when they're kicking everybody out, and my partner Leslie pointed and said, look at this giant urn. Underneath this urn there's this dragon on a very large Flower of Life pattern, and then there's a 3D Flower of Life sphere with these bows coming out of it, which, you know, when you see Nassim in his full presentation, you'll see that he talks about the quadrupole and the two poles of vortex going in and then two poles spiraling out like a spiral galaxy. So this could be kind of encoding that kind of spiral dynamic of galaxies as well as the protons sphere packing lattice work on the surface. So you've got the Flower of Life under the paw of all the Fu Dogs. You can actually tell how good a Chinese restaurant is if it has a really good Fu Dog with a really ornate Flower of Life under its paw. Then you know they've invested in their deco. Maybe their food is better. At least that's my personal take. And so you've got Flower of Life around the world. This is another 3D Flower of Life sphere at the Palace of Bangkok, Thailand. So China, Thailand, you know, India, the Middle East, Turkey, Egypt, all over the world, these same patterns show up. Nassim also looks at other forms of two-dimensional symbol in ancient Chinese culture. A lot of you have heard of this thing called the I Ching, and the I Ching happens to have 64 hexagrams, the same number of tetrahedrons you need to just begin to see the scaling of perfect vector equilibrium. You need 64 tetrahedrons to make 2 octaves of the cube octahedron. And Nassim just looked at this in a very literal geometric way and said, well, if I have 6 solid sticks, the only thing I can make out of this is a tetrahedron. And if I want to make a 64 tetrahedron grid like Marshall showed, you need 8 star tetrahedrons. And to make 1 star tetrahedron, you need a tetrahedron pointing up and a tetrahedron pointing down. So if you have 6 solid sticks to make your first tetrahedron pointing up, what do you need to make the one pointing down? You need the 6 broken sticks to point in the other direction. Unfortunately, my slide is not advancing right now. I might have to jump out here and manually go to the next slide. Pardon me. Okay, so you also can know about the yin-yang symbol, again, out of China. It's positive, negative, flow, equal and opposite. This is a great animation right out of the movie Thrive, out of the movie The Black Hole that Nassim put out, describing how a yin-yang is actually a great 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional yin-yang, which is the polar opposite dynamics that you experience in a dual torus structure. Now, in this talk, we haven't had a lot of time to talk about the dual torus structure of black holes, but this is a fundamental pattern of energy in the universe where information can go in towards singularity and back out again, out into the cloud, if you will, at the same time. And the yin-yang is a perfect 2-dimensional representation of that process. Now we're moving to a whole nother culture. This is the Mayan calendar. It's not the calendar that ends in 2012. This is the numerical calendar. Each one of those squares represents a different number. And you've got the Hunab Ku, which is another 2-dimensional symbol that encodes, sure enough, a spiral vortex going to singularity and a quadrupole with jets coming out. If you look at this and you add up all the squares that are black plus the ones that are enclosed by black, it adds up to 32 on each side, or 64 in total, which is the number of tetrahedrons you need to get to 2 octaves of vector equilibrium. 84 is the number in the ascending column in the middle, which is also the number of petals in the flower of life symbol. So you have 84 adding up all the rows, and if you add up all the squares and divide them by the number of squares, you get 7, which is the number that you get to, and then the next number, 8, is where the pattern repeats, and you get to the octave, both in music and in geometry. So a lot of numbers related to the geometry of space-time are encoded in the Mayan calendar, and as well in the geometry of the Aztec calendar. So we're looking now here at cymatic images on the top row that seem to match very closely stained glass windows out of the Catholic tradition, and then you'll also see that it matches the Aztec calendar that I just showed you, and even looking at DNA molecule structure from the top down and mapping numbers like phi and pi over on the far right. This is by a guy who has a great page called From Infinity to Affinity and Beyond. And so we see these commonalities of culture all over the place. And poor Robert Schoch, when he first started to think, maybe there is this ancient culture that's much older than what we were told about, they said, well, great, you're showing us this evidence of the Sphinx, but show us one single other shred of evidence of a culture that's older than, say, 12,000 years ago. And at the time, he didn't have any evidence. And then shortly thereafter, they discovered this site right here called Gölbekli Tepe. This is what it looked like here in Turkey in 1995 before they started excavating it. And now that they've excavated a small portion of this site, you can see that there are these incredibly large megalithic stones with very advanced carvings on it. And they've carbon dated this, you guys, not to 5,500 years ago like the Great Pyramid. We're talking 7,400 years earlier. We're talking 10,000 to 13,000 BC, carbon dating proven. This should be all over the headlines. This should be in every kid's textbook right now, saying that we were wrong that whole time. Every generation up until now was told something that we know is incorrect, which is that human culture didn't start 10,000 years ago. Now we know that there was this highly advanced site that was intentionally buried 13,000 years ago. Here's Robert Schoch. This guy is a hero in my mind, along with Graham Hancock and Nassim, for really daring to stick their neck out and say, I know you guys all think it's like this, but check this out. This evidence points that it's very different. And at the time, they were like, you know, where are your little pottery shards showing us this culture? And this is what they got, this incredibly ornate, amazingly beautiful site that was intentionally buried to preserve it. We still don't know why, but it's still being dug out. There's all these other circles that they have not excavated yet. There are these columns that are in a circle with two large ones in the middle, and they're guessing that there might have been a structure that went with this, like wood or something that is no longer around. But check this out. There's supposed to be, I think, 7, 8, 9, 10 of these circles, and most of them are under the ground still. It's going to take many years for them to carve it out. Graham Hancock, who is seen here in this picture, wrote a book 20 years ago called Fingerprints of the Gods, where he outlined this story that I've been basically telling this whole time, which is that there was probably a super ancient, super advanced culture that was lost to written history, and that civilization took thousands of years to rebuild itself to the point where they could build these kinds of megalithic structures again. And Graham has just completed a new book, a sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods, called Magicians of the Gods. And it only came out 2 weeks ago. I was very much hoping to get through the entire book before I was presenting this, but I actually had to move in the interim, and so I haven't had a ton of reading time. But I can tell you the summary of this book is that Graham went around the world in the last couple of years visiting a bunch of the sites that I've been mentioning, including Göbekli Tepe, where he got to interview the German archaeologist that was working on this before he died, he died a couple of years ago. And his hypothesis is, based on the evidence that he's seen, that there was a gigantic comet that broke up in our solar system, and multiple fragments of this comet hit the Earth about 12,800 years ago, and then there was another round that hit us about 11,600 years ago. And we're talking a big comet, not like the one that hit Ukraine a couple of years ago and smashed some windows. We're talking about one that vaporized the polar ice cap in seconds and caused the oceans of the world to rise by over 400 feet in a very short amount of time. Now, if you had an advanced civilization hanging out on the planet, you would of course build your civilization on the seashore for obvious reasons, which means that all those cultures that were around at that time got flooded big time. And that is probably what led to these flood stories that we've heard from cultures around the world, including in the Bible, right? The Great Flood. All these different cultures, something like 300 of them, all are saying the same thing. So what did Graham Hancock do? He started looking for other evidence of a culture that was around the same time as Göbekli Tepe. Because if those guys were around at Göbekli Tepe, there was probably another culture. And so what did he do? He went to Indonesia. And some of you may have not heard of this yet. It's a site in Indonesia that is also very old, and at the time, the archaeological people in the area said, oh yeah, we can date this. It's probably around the same time as these other sites that are nearby. Well, on the surface, sure. But if you dig underneath this and you start carbon dating the layers underneath this pyramid, then you start getting older and older dates. And they kept digging down. Here it is from far away. The lowest levels that they've been able to get to, dirt and organic material in between gigantic megalithic carved stones, many layers deep inside this pyramid, are carbon dated to over 20,000 years old. That's 7,000 years, again, later than Göbekli Tepe. The timeline of when we got advanced technology keeps moving back and back and back. Same thing here in Bosnia. This is the Bosnian pyramid, and Samir, I forget how to pronounce his last name, Samir O something, is the discoverer of this pyramid, and it's more massive than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Again, the locals and the establishment are skeptical of this being a pyramid, but he has discovered chambers underneath the pyramid and advanced tunnel system that goes all around Bosnia and connects to other sites in the area. I'm very excited actually to announce here for the first time on this call that Nassim Haramein and myself are going to go together to the Bosnian pyramids next year at the end of a 1-week-long cruise in Croatia. October 9 to 16, Nassim and I will be presenting on a cruise ship in the coast of Croatia, going to check out different sites along the Aegean Sea, and then we're going to meet Samir, and he's going to give us a personal tour of the Bosnian pyramids. So if you're interested in that, I'll post a link to that event. It hasn't been really promoted yet. It just got confirmed. But I'm very excited to, go visit another one of these great sites, because just like Nassim and Graham, I'm very interested in personally seeing a lot of this stuff. So come check out those pyramids with us. Here we're looking at Tokyo and Peru. Commonalities that you wouldn't think. Amazingly polished, fine stonework is found all over the world, from Bolivia and Peru to Greece, and crazy shapes. How are they putting this together? They must be using some sort of technology that's different than any technology we know of today. Changes the way that we think about these ancient cultures. So maybe they had some technology that was enabling them to move these stones with ease. They must have had some way of making these stones less massive, which means gravitational control. If you understand how the universe works, and you understand the geometry of space-time, and you understand how flows of energy work, perhaps you could then understand and even command the gravitational field and be able to move objects with ease and be able to manipulate matter and make these incredibly fine cuts in stone. This stone has been cut so smooth and polished that it's almost like a mirror. We would have an incredibly hard time doing this today. All this points to highly advanced technology from a very long time ago. And of course the question is, how did they get this knowledge? How did they get this technology? Look at the symmetry of this face. You can't just take a chisel and start going at this face and making it this exactly perfect. You can't just cut an 82-ton statue out of a quarry and bring it hundreds of miles away by dragging it with vine ropes. When they found King Ramses II statue here, they had to put the museum around the statue rather than moving the statue to the museum, because they were going to have to cut it into pieces just to be able to move it. How are they going to move this obelisk? This didn't even make it out of the quarry because it cracked before they could move it. But you could tell they were thinking that they could lift this. We would not be able to lift this today. Now we go to the oldest written language we have, the Sumerian tablets. You can check out the work of Sitchin, who did a translation on this. Whether or not he did a perfect translation is pretty important, because if you do an imperfect translation and then you misinterpret it, you might come up with some ideas like there's evil reptilian beings that have infiltrated the U.S. government that are waiting to take over the world, and all this crazy stuff that you hear people like David Icke saying. And then you've got Nassim, who says, no, there's no such thing as a bad extraterrestrial, and I know this because there's no way that you can use the type of technology that you would have to use to create these things for ill will. And I'll explain why he says that in a second. But basically, Nassim thinks that this object being shown here on the pedestal in between the humans on the left and the sun gods, quote unquote, on the right, that gave mankind this object, he thinks this is the type of technology that you would have had to use to make these megalithic structures. A black sun, a little black hole in a can, if you will. I like to think of going to the sun with an ice cream scoop and scooping out a little star, putting it on a table. If you had a star on your table, it would be very bright. It would have lots of energy coming off of it. You'd have to wear veils over your eyes because it was so bright you couldn't even look at it. And you would want to make sure you only put good energy into there, because it's an instantaneous feedback loop of information, a black hole. The information that goes in is radiated back out again, and you don't want to put ill will in your heart into this object, or else it won't work. And so Nassim looks at this black stone that is described in the Quran, and the black sun as described in the Sumerian tablet, as well as other objects, and thinks that these are all being referenced as the type of technology they use to do things like take a stone like this and move it. This is Baalbek, in where Lebanon is, and they were pulling these stones up to the top of the hill there. I'll give you as many slaves and vine ropes as you want. You're not pulling that stone anywhere. We know they have advanced technologies in the old days because we still have things like the Baghdad batteries holding a low level of electric charge, and obviously all the evidence of these megalithic structures. Haramain is an Islamic name because Nassim's father is Iranian, and Nassim's grandfather was somebody who would take prayers of the people that were too poor to do the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage that all Muslims are supposed to do at least once in their lifetime, to this very sacred spot called the Kaaba in Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia. And so Nassim's grandfather would take a camel 6 months and go 7 times in a circular vortex around this object, like you're supposed to do, but he would do it 7 times for every prayer that he was carrying. And when he died, he was 128 years old or something like this. And so you're seeing now commonality between the black sun, the black stone in the Quran, which is a highly symbolic object that's of high faith in Islamic faith, the black stone, and then in the Bible it's described as the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. Nassim was surprised to see that God wasn't an old white guy with a beard. In this ancient Masonic Bible, God is actually a tetrahedron, and so he's tying together here what the Ark of the Covenant was. He thinks it's a capacitor built to hold a little star, like you see there, and you have to wear veils, as I said, and they built a tabernacle to protect people from that energy. And when they found the copper scrolls among the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was made of the purest copper ever found, and it outlined the 64 things you needed to be able to approach the Ark of the Covenant. And the last thing that Nassim was really great at decoding here in terms of these ancient symbols is the Tetragrammaton. If you look in early Bibles, they say you're not supposed to say the name of God, which in Hebrew is Yud-He, Vav-He, or Yahweh. And you add those 4 Hebrew letters in the form of a Pythagorean tetrachus, or inside of a tetrahedron, and when you add up all the numbers, it equals what they call the great name of God, being 72. And again, this is encoded information. If you want to make a star tetrahedron, and you want to take 8 star tetrahedrons and put them together to make a 64 tetrahedron grid, then you need 72 plus 72 equals 144. If you've gone to Catholic school, you'll remember that phrase of the 144 faces of God, or the 144,000 people that are going to ascend. But really, what this is talking about is the 144 open faces on a 64 tetrahedron grid. If you count the number of open faces on a 64 tetrahedron grid, it's exactly 144. So the numbers and the geometry of everything from the Bible to the Quran to the Mayan calendar to the I Ching, even here all the way back to Kabbalistic tradition and the Tree of Life, all encodes the same geometry, 3D tetrahedral array with spheres around it forming this vector equilibrium in space. And so how did these ancient peoples know this? They must have gotten this information from somewhere, and the theory goes that perhaps the information was from not our tetra. I won't have a lot of time left, but this of course opens up the idea of, did this information come from outside of our tetra, otherwise known as extra tetra real information, extraterrestrials. And you can get into these discussions and talk about things like crop circles, anomalies that are showing up in modern times. These are not ancient, these are recent, and they perfectly match the geometries that we've been looking at, like the Tree of Life right here. I feel like we could go for a long time just in the idea of the extraterrestrial phenomenon, but that's where, to me, this ancient origins leads. Nassim talks about this at length in his videos, and we talk about it to a degree in the course. But I think in future courses within the Resonance Academy, this is something that we should explore, because you can see that if we understand how to spin some geometry, we might be able to get some power out of it, and this will really change the way that we do business here on this planet. It seems like that there's some signs being sent to us. In other words, kids didn't run out of that car on that road in the middle of the day and make this thing across the street from Stonehenge without anybody seeing them, because that's what happened. This crop circle showed up in 45 minutes in the middle of the day. I encourage you to look into the crop circles. There's so many. They're so awesome. I spend a long time in my presentations talking about them. I just wanted to show you briefly because it's modern evidence of highly advanced information being transmitted to us. with the crops being woven together, highly ornate. I doubt people drinking beer with boards and ropes were able to make this in the middle of the night with no sound and no light, not getting caught, and not having any way of looking at it from above to see that they're doing a perfect job. All of it fits within hexagonal and torus geometries. It's not just random stuff. It's perfectly constructed geometries. So it leads to big questions, like how did we get here? How did life start on this planet? Did we really evolve the way we thought? It seems like we got to some highly advanced technologies that were then lost due to cataclysms within our sphere, where comets hit and stuff like this. This is the Arecibo message that we received as a crop circle. I encourage you guys to look into this. I apologize, I'm not going to go into all the details of the crop circles. This whole section could take an hour. I'm just flashing through it because I do want to get to the question and answer. And I hope you guys appreciated this overview, because again, this is really skimming the surface. We want to get into the sun gods that we see evidence of. I mean, it's not just stories. We have skulls that prove that there are hominids on this planet that do not match Homo sapien DNA. You can check out Brian Forrester's work and Hugh Newman, Megalithomania, and Graham Hancock's new book, and there's all kinds of new evidence coming out of these skulls. Here's the Star Child skull. That's one of the most famous. Lloyd Pye was the one who brought that around. And then there's artifacts that also show alien type faces all the way down to ships and little planes. When I first did these talks, Ancient Aliens wasn't on TV, but obviously if you look at every episode of Ancient Aliens, you'll see some of this stuff. Check out this great artifact with a ship and a beam coming out to some angel guy flying with a cool helmet on. I mean, this stuff is starting to be carbon dated as thousands of years old, and it's very exciting that this information is coming out. There's actually a YouTube video of Nassim talking about some of these artifacts that you can search and find. So look at these ancient Inca and ancient Egyptian artifacts looking the same again, and this is the last slide I show because just recently they found this skull, and those etchings that were made on there were made by Homo erectus. So the idea that we didn't have symbols and complex thought until 10,000 years ago was off by 490,000 years. This shell was etched by Homo erectus, you guys. That means we were thinking in symbols 500,000 years ago. That means that we have to completely rewrite our entire history and all of our textbooks. And Marshall mentioned Festival Earth. I think it's important for us to know this history because then it shows that Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, look at them. There they are in that yellow branch right next to each other. All of the religions came from seeded information that was much, 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 much older. So we can all stop fighting right now. Every religion is the same in the sense that they're describing the same questions in a different way. Like we dance different styles of dance and we have different styles of music. I would love to see us get to the point where we celebrate all the religions, call it Festival Earth, call it good, have a good time. Everybody can stop fighting right now. And so, yeah, it goes beyond just talking about this stuff because it's interesting and the history of the ancient cultures. We really need to learn how to get along on this planet. Every day I look at the news and I'm very disappointed that we're acting the way we are. And so I hope that you guys will take this information, put it out there, and spread the word. And come check out some of these other courses and the other modules of this course. It's super dense, super epic downloads of information, and I hope I conveyed as much as I could here in the hour that I had. But thank you. It's an honor to be in this position. I, just like you, came across this information, thought it was so cool, just kept digging and digging and digging, and I'm still digging. And so is Graham Hancock and everybody else. So please contribute your own ideas, and we'll collaborate, and I'll see you on all the social networks and stuff like that. And come on this cruise with me and Nassim next year. I'll post the link, and I'll see you out there somewhere out in the world. I'll be doing talks all over. Hopefully we get to South America soon.
Awesome, Jamie. Thanks,
you. Marshall.
That was a tour de force of how
I only had an hour, so I wanted to.
Yeah, no, it was great. What I like about it is that even though you were going very fast through some sections, there was a continuity of the idea of developing how these cultures around the world exhibit the same symbols, structures, architecture, etc., which really does open these questions up. And the fact that Hancock and others are finding evidence of cultures that go back tens of thousands and now even hundreds of thousands of years potentially, but especially in the last 100,000 years, it really does change our perspective on our origins, and especially when you consider how are these things built. I know one of the questions that came up in the chat was, isn't it possible to build a Great Pyramid with our technology today? And to my knowledge, no, it's not. To build something of that scale with such heavy blocks using the kinds of cranes and things we have, to my knowledge, is really not, and just transporting multi-ton blocks and things like that, such distances over sand, it's really hard to fathom, and there aren't really good plausible explanations for how it was done so long ago, especially. And so it's very compelling to really consider what was known back then. And when we look at the fundamental patterns that we see as the foundation of this model of unified physics and the implications that this model points to with gravity control, energy generation, etc., and we see these symbols back in these ancient cultures, it does really begin to paint a picture of the possibility that this was known a long time ago and perhaps carried forth for many centuries, millennia, really millennia actually, and possibly forgotten, with the impacts of the comets and the flooding and the global catastrophes that pretty much wiped out the evidence for those civilizations, and yet we see these symbols and these structures that do suggest that perhaps this was known a long time ago, and we're rediscovering it now, and these were clues. So your presentation really helps to paint that picture clearly, and
cool.
Yeah, quite awesome that you can roll that off so well. You've been doing it a long time. So
well, Marshall, I think I calculated once. I've done close to 300 presentations.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's like, it's just natural at this point. I'm just excited to check out Graham Hancock's new book because I know he's got a whole bunch of new information, stuff that I didn't even cover because I haven't even gotten to it yet. But I did want to include the site in Indonesia because that's really exciting new spot that they're uncovering.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Well, let's check in on a couple of questions here. We'll go for a little bit longer and see what might be good to touch in on. The most popular question I actually believe we've pretty well covered. It's this first one that says, Rudolf Steiner, German scientist and philosopher, told the world in the 1900s that we were just a rerun of many civilizations on Earth as far as 400,000 years ago. That makes sense when you look at the evidence left behind with monuments that we could not replicate today with our technology. What is your opinion? I think we just really laid that opinion out, or at least a representation of evidence that could support that idea pretty well. Well, the next most popular question, just to kind of follow in the sequence, is about artificial intelligence as one of our greatest enemies. What is your take on AI? It's an interesting question, and it's even interesting in relationship to kind of where we've been and where we're heading, because it's a threshold of a possibility of creating technologies that can become intelligent in their own manner to such a degree that perhaps they can, become uncontrollable, become autonomous, and potentially become dangerous. So it's really a forward-looking question about the evolution of our knowledge, our technological capabilities, and even the application of these kinds of technologies. And it's a good ethical consideration. I can't speak for Nassim or the Resonance Project kind of as a whole. Personally, I think it's a very important, as is, you know, so many of the new technology developments, nanotechnology, of course, genetic modification, the things that are very much happening already. Every one of these has the potential to be dangerous, to be so-called our enemies, because they could completely backfire on us, and all of a sudden we could end the show. So every one of these kinds of technological considerations have ethical implications, and, you know, even physical dangers inherent in them, and need to be really deeply considered for all those possibilities before we just jump ahead all excited because we can. You know, so any comments on that, Jamie?
Well, I think in terms of artificial intelligence, it comes down to the people that are making the intelligence and the intentions. I think that if we collectively as a planet get our priorities straight, ethically, morally, socially, that we could make really great artificial intelligence and, you know, in bestow it or endow it with the same kind of ideologies that we have, and hopefully it will behave. And if it doesn't, we'll have mechanisms in place to prevent it from going that way. And I know that Hawking and Elon Musk and all these other guys are all really worried about this. This is the biggest problem that there is. But to me, I'm most worried about the people that are making the stuff, and the military industrialized complex people and their moral judgment more than I am the technology.
Yeah, that gets to the heart of the matter right there. It's up to us. Yeah, absolutely.
Much.
This next most popular question kind of even begins to address some of that consideration, and it's ties it into the geometry. How can the vector equilibrium be a guide for our psycho-spiritual philosophical approach to life?
That's all you, Marshall.
Well, we'll start with my perspective on that.
I mean, because Bucky basically wrote the book on that.
Yeah, essentially, he does talk about this philosophically. When you read Buckminster Fuller, he is a very pragmatic person, and his writing is very kind of dense, and you really have to take time to get into it. And once you do, you start to see that there's an underlying philosophical and spiritual kind of message, sometimes more overt, but also just more kind of between the lines. And Bucky, I would say, you know, in what I've learned really from studying his perspective is that the vector equilibrium really represents the stillness, the nothing that is at the heart of everything. That when we, for example, go into meditation and go into silence and stillness and find that centered, quiet place in ourselves, that's when we're actually stilling our oscillating minds and consciousness, which is just as much tied into the oscillations of the physical universe. They're really, from the way I see it, one and the same: physical, metaphysical, mind, matter. Where is the distinction really? And fundamentally, at the center of it all, as Bucky said, the vector equilibrium is at the center of the universe, meaning everywhere present there's a stillness, there's a 0 point that's present. And we can actually, both with our consciousness and through meditation and other kinds of techniques, yoga, things like that, bring ourselves into a harmonious, quiet, still alignment with that center stillness and potential. And at the same time also use the understanding of the energetic dynamics that the model shows as a basis for creating technologies that shift from a really a conflicted relationship with the dynamics of the universe, that most of what we do now with energy generation through oil and petroleum technologies, carbon-based technologies, etc., nuclear, all these things where we're basically kind of exploding and breaking apart, this can actually be a synthesizing and a technology basis that will bring a harmonization, into our relationship with the cosmos, which is absolutely critical. I think another question down the way kind of asks about what's it going to take to make these kinds of shifts at this time, and having awareness of these fundamental patterns, having awareness of the relationship to even our origins, and carrying that forward from where we are now to where we're heading with this kind of a basis of understanding can both spiritually, metaphysically, in our minds, in our relationship with each other, as well as in the technologies we develop, bring a harmonic relationship to how we are living and what we are creating and how we're creating technologies and social systems. So fundamentally, the vector equilibrium is one aspect of describing that core fundamental state, with the torus being the dynamic, more spherical, energetic flow pattern. So having awareness of these fundamental patterns can help us really center ourselves in our spiritual, philosophical approach to life, and then develop our technologies and systems from there. So, any comments on that, Jamie?
Well done. Yeah, I mean, I think of it as, it relates to another question, right, that was right in there. That's like, if we're all one thing, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
And the vector equilibrium is doing the one thing that we're all doing, which, I mean, you could describe it in a lot of different ways. One thing to say is that we're all oscillating. Like, information's going in, and it's also going out at the same time, and the universe is learning about itself, and we are the universe telling the universe more about itself. It's a constant feedback loop of mechanism of information happening at all scales, and we're embedded inside of that. Like, you have to put food in here and it comes out the other side, or it doesn't work out too well. You have to breathe in and then breathe out, and if you stop doing that, then you stop being. And that's what the universe is doing on all scales. And so we're just fractally embedded into that thing that is the one thing, and we are the one thing telling the one thing about the one thing.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, here we are doing it in a fancy way on the internet where we can talk all over the world, which is super cool, taking it next fractal level. I get to put out a bunch of stuff, and I have no idea who's listening to me or where they are, except for the people that are chatting here on the side, but it's pretty awesome that we get to put it out there on social media. I think this, and somebody's like, no, I think this, and then everybody's like, hey, let's meet in the square and get that guy out of here that we don't like that's leading our country. You can do some amazing stuff, right? So we're all doing it. We're all doing the one thing, call it whatever you want.
Yeah. Yeah, in the unified physics model, it mathematically shows the unification of everything. That, as we saw with the relationship of the inside of the proton to the outside rest of the universe, there's a holographic relationship there. It's completely connected. So it is one thing, and that one thing is made of a vast diversification of expression. And for whatever reason, it's designed to be that way. As Nissim would say, as we like to say, we're serving a role of the universe learning about itself, and this feedback loop, and ever greater levels of coherence in sentience and awareness and information synthesis and knowledge. William Brown talked a lot about that in his presentation in the previous Channel 64. And so that one thing is diversifying to explore and learn and discover itself, and we have this wonderful, quite amazing role to play. Certainly we're not the only ones, but we do have what, at least at this time, appears to be a very unique role that is probably shared throughout the cosmos, and I think we're going to be learning more about that in the not too distant future. We'll just do a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up here. This next one from Obroy1 is a kind of lots of different things, and I'm not really actually clear about the questions enough to maybe go into. Some of them are very specific and that too difficult to go into at this time. role of ethics in the pursuit of sacred knowledge. Well, we just talked about some of that. So I think we'll let that one be for now. This next one talks about the shift of consciousness from disharmony to harmonious existence, and a critical number of people have awareness of sacred geometry, spiritual awareness, love for the rest of mankind. Yes, this is exactly what we're talking about. And it is the critical step that we are in. And what's indicative of it happening is exactly this kind of gathering, sharing this kind of information, these kind of questions, and really working together to bring our awareness of what has been more in the sacred, ancestral, ancient origins, sacred geometry realm, now into application in physics. And the cosmic geometry, the cosmometry that the physics shows us, of course, is meeting that spiritual tradition. So the meeting of science and spirit is very much inherent in what this all is indicating. So yeah, that's exactly, I think, the most important thing we could be doing right now. How about your comments on that, Jamie?
Yeah, again, I think you nailed it.
Well, you travel around the world, though, which, you get to experience how this is actually happening globally and have these very direct presentations and conversations around all this. What's your experience about, where this is at in the world?
I can tell you that everywhere I go, the same kind of people are coming out that, have the same thoughts and the same intentions, that they are a little confused by the stuff that they were told, because they should be, because a lot of that stuff is turning out to be incorrect, and that they want to create more coherency and have more fun and try to fix some of these crazy things that are happening. And collectively, as we do stuff just like we're doing right now on a global scale, we're increasing the coherency, and it's kind of a team effort. When I go out into the world, I just kind of think of Team Earth, and so when you do that, then you're holding doors for people, you're like helping anybody who needs help, you're like having empathy for people, you're like taking in refugees, you're sending food to people that are starving. And if we all did that, everything would be fine. But there's people that have very strange ideas, and I think it's because they have this idea of separation, like, oh, I'm over here, those guys are over there, we're totally separate. And then if you understood the physics of it, like, no, not only that, every single bit of space in between you and that person is completely filled with energy, and anytime you do anything bad, you're reverberating that bad stuff out into the entire universe. So you might want to be careful of your self-talk, because you're talking to yourself, you're talking to the universe. Feed it really good stuff, and you'll get really good stuff back. The Indians call it karma, and it's a real thing. There's a mechanics to that. It's not just like foo-foo, new age, blah, blah, blah. It's like there's mechanics to it. And thank you, Nassim, for writing the math to describe the stuff that the esoteric ascended masters of the planet, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, all the way down the line, have been trying to tell us in poetry. And then people that don't understand how to think like that, they need numbers and math. We have the math for you now, so you can prove it scientifically. Different way of knowing, like, oh, cool, I've got my science mind and my spirit mind all linking up together. That's where it really hits, and something like spirit science, that name itself says it right there. Good work, Jordan. Now you have a 10 million likes on your Facebook page. You can pump out some really great information, So everybody share good things out there in the world, and it'll get better, quick, exponentially.
Yeah, man. Great. Well, I think we'll leave it at that. Today was really intended to provide a very kind of high-level overview of some of what's explored in the delegate program in this 5th module called Ancient Cultures and the Fundamental, or Ancient Origins and the Fundamental Pattern. And so we gave you a good taste. It goes a bit more in depth in the program. So if you haven't checked it out already, please do. Yeah, great to explore this with you, Jamie, as always, and thank you, everybody. I'm going to let Teresa do a few announcements as we wrap up, and then we'll take it from there.
That was great, you guys. I knew it was going to be a fun ride, and it was totally a ride. It was really fantastic. The visuals were great. Both of you were so relaxed and, you know, embodied in what you have to share. So we had a lot of fun watching you and listening to you. So thank you. And these guys are both faculty in the Academy, and as we move into the new year, we're going to start having some elective courses that they're going to be leading, both in cosmometry and other topics, so you're going to be seeing more of them. There was a question in the chat about whether this replay was going to be available, and absolutely it will. Usually just following it, it'll be pretty quick. We'll also send emails out. And this is another one that you can share with your friends. So share far and wide and say, hey, this is what's happening in the Academy. Come check it out. And if you're a student, tomorrow is a breakout group. And I think Marshall and maybe Jamie, I don't know, Jamie, if you're going to come on the breakout group tomorrow, but it's a nice opportunity to actually have students asking some questions of Marshall and Jamie, and then you'll be able to be in your small groups and talk with each other about these exciting ideas. And for students, next week, live with Nassim. He's going to be coming on next Wednesday. So we really had an action-packed month. And if you're not yet a student, we have a special gift from Channel 64.
Whoops, Teresa, your sound just went off as you were saying that.
There, I'm back. If you're not a student and you sign up between now and the end of the day on Sunday, we're going to give you a little special gift from Channel 64 because we want you to come and play in the Academy. And that special gift is if you enter the code Channel 64, all one word, into the link that I'm going to post in the chat, but every time I try to do it, mutes me, so I'll do it in a minute. If you sign up before Sunday with that code, you'll save $64. That's our gift from Channel 64 from our virtual classroom here in the Resonance Academy, and we want you to come and play because this is where cutting-edge conversations are happening like nowhere else. So, Jamie and Marshall, how about a few final words from the two of you as we go? Jamie, why don't we start with you?
Well, thanks, Teresa, for holding it down always and being such a good vibe host and kind of laying it out for everybody. I just want to say personally that the Resonance Academy is so next level. I spent years and years going out trying to get as much information into a short time as I possibly could, and even when I taught delegate programs and would speak for 20 hours in a weekend, I would only be able to convey a small fraction of the information that's encoded into the Academy because it has links to all sorts of other source material, books, videos, timelines, quotes from Nassim, all the papers, and then Nassim breaking down each paper line by line, saying this is how this works, this is how this works, stuff that I never even saw Nassim speak about in person. So I'm still learning stuff from the Academy because there's so much stuff in there that you can barely keep track of all of it because there's just like every module you can go rabbit hole style forever, which is why we're going to bust it out into further courses and modules. And so I'm excited because Nassim and I spent so much time and energy flying around burning fossil fuels to talk, and now we can all meet virtually no matter what time zone we're in and chat like we are here anytime. And you meet people from all over the world, and you know there's groups that are forming in Australia based on meeting each other through stuff like this, and it's really a great hub. And it took a lot of work, and so congratulations to the team that put this together. And Nassim, it was kind of the culmination of 30 years of his life's work. Now it's all formatted and ready to go. You can do it at your own pace. And so I got to get back in there and keep adding some stuff because new information keeps coming out at such a fast rate. I just want to keep adding to it. That's what we're constantly updating it and putting in new studies that come out and stuff like this. So that's what we're going to do some this winter, I think.
Great, great. Yeah, well said about the resources offered there in delegate program. And a lot of these ideas really may stretch our understanding, maybe our beliefs about what's true and real. And that's part of the beauty of the times we're in, I think, is that we are being challenged to really, let ourselves think more broadly, more openly. And it's often difficult to have a conversation about these ideas in some of the academic institutions, as was described about Robert Schoch exploring his or presenting his findings of this 10,000-year-old, what he thought was maybe 30,000-year-old, and then getting ridiculed for a while until suddenly there was evidence. So being willing to just take this in, this kind of information, look at the unified physics model, really take it in and consider, is this a working model? Does it work for me? Does the mathematics work? How does this apply? And the implications of what it can mean going forward. All of this is really being offered and presented as a way of inviting this inquiry, and it's great. I appreciate everybody being here, asking all the questions, being willing to question even what we're sharing. We're open to all of that, and we actually invite input and being challenged, because we all need to actually challenge ourselves in our thinking, and we do have to make some fundamental shifts, and we really offer what we do with the hopes that it will provide very pragmatic scientific basis for making those shifts, as well as the kind of the spiritual, philosophical, ethical foundation upon which we can then see, we are all unified, so let's actually live that way. So thanks for being here and sharing in that journey with us today, and join us in the Academy if you haven't already. We love having you there. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. See you
Bye,
soon.
everybody.
Take care, and as Nassim would say, may the vacuum be with you.
Bye-bye.